Hello, Buzzkillers. It's the old professor here, busting myths, taking names. We're going to talk today about a great book that I wanted to talk about for a long time. Public Confessions, the religious conversions that changed American politics. And fortunately for you, fortunately for me as well, we have the author on the line via the internets, via Zoom, and that is Dr. Rebecca Davis. Dr. Davis, thanks so much for coming on the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
This book is so important because not only does it highlight these religious conversions, it tells us a lot more about the people involved, but perhaps more about the American public, about American politics, about the way people react to change of this kind, our celebrity culture, and on and on and on. What first brought you to the subject, and why did you decide to write this book?
I have been studying American religion and 20th century US history for a while and was always fascinated and a bit perplexed by the way historians tend to talk about the religious identities of the people they study, as if someone's religious identity is fixed, is static. And I knew enough from my own family and from the families of lots of other people that folks move in and out of different faiths with a shocking frequency and have done so since the beginnings of European arrivals in the North American continent. And in fact, religious conversion is one of the stories of the making of the United States and the shaping of its history. And so I was just broadly fascinated by that and curious about how I could find a way to say something about that that was different. And poking around in libraries and archives, as historians do, I came across the story of Clare Boothe Luce. And she was the person who first drew me in, a former member of Congress. She was a famous playwright. And in 1946, she had this internationally reported conversion to Catholicism from Protestantism. And everything about that fascinated me. Then you move on from there to keep learning as much as you can.
Well, our buzzkillers will know a lot about Clare Boothe Luce because, of course, we've had Professor Nash on, and we've done, I think, 2 shows about her, and then one show that was about the first female ambassadors of the United States, and she was in that. She's an extraordinarily important person in American history and American politics at the time, and yet people don't know her now. And I just think, do you mind putting her more in context of American sort of, or her visibility in context of American history at that time? Most people now don't know who the ambassador to anywhere is, but now they knew Clare Boothe Luce during her period.
She was one of the most famous American women during much of her lifetime, certainly by the 1930s, 1940s, and for a few decades thereafter. She remained politically, nationally significant into the 1970s and 80s when she was appointed to various presidential commissions, usually related to foreign policy. But her whole life was about becoming known. She had a mother who sort of pushed her into an early marriage to a very wealthy guy who turned out to be an abusive alcoholic. But she had one child, a daughter, from that marriage. And then she divorced this man and went on to make her own way as a magazine writer, editor, publisher. And she, in doing this work, was also writing plays. And she got involved. She wrote a play called The Women, which was the first all-female cast production on Broadway. And it premiered in the mid-1930s. And it was around that time that she met Henry Luce, who was already very well known as the publisher of Time magazine. They had a brief romance and then a marriage, and did not have any children together, but they were sort of a celebrity media couple. Mm-hmm. And she then ran for Congress, served 2 terms in Congress, was one of only 7 or 8 women in the US Congress at the time, and was one of the most visible of that small group because of her fame. You know, she loved the limelight. She loved beautiful clothes. She allowed reporters into her homes to do profiles of her interior decor. She understood the trappings of fame and understood media. She had been a celebrity reporter as part of her magazine career. She had written those celebrity profiles as well as sort of snarky comments about celebrities as part of her own journalism career. Then, of course, as you mentioned, in the 1950s, she was appointed the ambassador to Italy and the Vatican. She served a sort of controversial ambassadorship there, but continued to be very involved in the American public life. She wrote for Sports Illustrated. She did all kinds of other public-facing work throughout her life.
Do you mind telling us, how much do we know about her faith before her conversion? How much do we know about her Protestantism, basically?
We don't know a whole lot. She did attend an Episcopal girls' school at one point. She was raised by her mother, and it was Clare and a younger brother. Their father had left them at some point early on, and she does not appear to have been terribly invested in religion. What's challenging is that a lot of what we know about her early religious education is what she told people about it. And Clare Luce said a lot about her decision to become Catholic and why it was so meaningful to her. But everyone, when we narrate our own lives, we often go back and see things that happened long ago as signs of the things that happened subsequently. And that's a really powerful phenomenon for religious converts or for anybody who makes a really dramatic change in their life, trying to sort of go back and look at the things that may have been somewhat random earlier in life or unrelated and assemble them as steps along the path toward the ultimate decision. So she began to write about experiences as a teenager being by the ocean and sort of having this overwhelming spiritual experience. And then later in life, as a Catholic, thinking about that as a moment when she was being reached by God and sort of brought closer to the decision she would eventually make. She wrote about a trip she made to the Italian front as a member of the Military Affairs Committee in the 1940s and seeing a priest and American soldiers celebrating Mass and being sort of overcome by that witnessing and said, I now understand it was the Eucharist was present. The Holy Presence was there and I felt it. And that was what I understood. So it's not what is clearer is that by the 1940s, she was in crisis. And that appears to be more what led her on a path of searching for some sort of belief system that would help her live, really. She was suicidal, it seems, and was casting about for some sort of belief structure to keep herself going.
So then how does she convert? Well, I should say, first of all, we need to tell everyone when she converts in. And then, are there people who help her? Are there people who help convince her? How does she go about it?
From what I could tell from reading in her papers, there's a priest who's from the Chicago area who starts writing to her, and he's sort of smitten with her. Mm-hmm. And he is sort of infatuated with her. And he writes her these very emotionally compelling letters and starts to talk to her about the truths that he thinks she needs. And she plays along and starts to read. And she was someone who had a bit of a formal education, but Clare Luce was a voracious reader throughout her life. And so she really did teach herself a lot of Catholic thought, sort of going back and reading the classics of Catholicism, some with the encouragement of this priest, Edward Wyatrack. And he, though, at a certain point says, you need to talk to Sheen. Sheen was, of course, one of the most important Catholic leaders in the United States in the mid-20th century. And he's based in Washington, D.C.
This is, of course, Archbishop.
This is Monsignor Fulton Sheen, who later became Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Right, okay.
And she starts meeting with Fulton Sheen at his residence. He's also in D.C., where she's there during Congress is in session. And she finds in him an intellectual partner. Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to take a step back. Clare Boothe Luce was this really intelligent, really successful woman. And at every step in her career, people are telling her, oh, aren't you cute? Isn't it nice that a woman could try to do these things? And she faces extraordinarily overt sexism, what we would today recognize as sexual harassment, throughout her entire career. She had a very complicated marriage with Henry Luce. I think, from what I could tell from reading letters and getting deeply into her personal archive, I think, though the marriage was probably sexless after a certain point and antagonistic in many ways, he liked talking with her. He liked arguing with her, and she enjoyed that he saw her as a conversation partner, that they could really get into ideas together, and that by being married, they could bring all these other smart, interesting, influential people around their table and have interesting conversations. That she could be a person right at the heart of the biggest ideas of the day.
Right.
And I think that Fulton Sheen offered her something similar. He wrote to her extremely respectful letters, seemed to really admire her as a thinker, and took her seriously. And there were very, very few men in the mid-20th century United States who took Clare Boothe Luce seriously. She succeeded in many ways in spite of a lot of the people in power that she interacted with. Something about Catholic theology of the real presence, the sense that she could be in the real presence, that through the miracle of the Eucharist and the Mass, that she could be present with Christ in these places and feel the Holy Spirit, was deeply moving to her. In 1942, her only child, her daughter, died in a terrible car accident. Anne Brokaw was just 19 years old and was a student at Stanford University. And so it is 2 years after that, 1944, that Clare Luce starts to exchange letters with Wyatt and then starts to visit Fulton Sheen to learn more from him and to study with him about Catholicism. So she writes about how she tried psychoanalysis, she tried all these other things. None of them helped her out of her depression, but it was the knowledge of, the experience of the real presence of Christ through Catholic ritual that gave her life meaning again.
Okay, then how does she go about dealing with, well, I should ask first, how does she present this to her husband, or does she present it at all? And how does she wrestle with, or do we know how she wrestles with the idea that in a heavily Protestant country and in a heavily Protestant Washington, D.C., and in an uneven, probably even heavier Protestant social circle that she's in, how does she deal with the idea that, oh, people are going to change their opinions of me if I convert?
This is one of the most fascinating and the darkest parts of her story that I came across. So Henry Luce was quite famously in his age the child of Presbyterian missionaries to China. He was born in China to his missionary parents. And this is part of why he took a really hardline pro-nationalist view when the Communist Revolution happens in China, and is really at the forefront of American foreign policy hawks in opposition to communist China. There is a letter to Clare Boothe Luce from her mother-in-law following her conversion, basically saying, you have betrayed everything that this family stands for, and you're probably going to go to hell for it, effectively. Like, this
Wow.
this is just a terrible thing that you've done. I didn't find letters from Henry Luce around that time, but I did find a letter that Clare wrote, and I'm not sure if she ever sent it to him, but it was a letter that she wrote in the midst of a sort of grief. Apparently, he had been supportive of her decision to convert.
Oh, right.
And she wrote in it, I went into this decision in a sort of spiritual honeymoon, that you would stand by me as I made this transition. She comes to find out, or she believes, that he only supported her because he thought it would require their marriage to be annulled.
Oh.
And he wanted to marry his girlfriend. He'd been having a long-running affair by this point. And so she says, I feel completely betrayed by you, that in this, the most important decision I've made in my life, you lied to me that you supported me in it. And then she says, and by the way, now you're never getting a divorce from me.
Yeah.
Like I'll just never do it for you now. And she never did. So that is that story. But again, they had a really complicated marriage. They lived somewhat separately, somewhat together. And one of their mutual friends in the 1950s is John Courtney Murray, who's this great US Catholic intellectual. They have him over for dinner at their Connecticut home. They hang out a lot together. And at one point, there's this exchange in the early 1950s that Henry Luce signs saying he promises that if certain things happen, he too will consider going through the baptism and conversion process as a Catholic. So I don't know if that was a joke. I don't know what the circumstances were that he said that. He, of course, never converted. He remained a Protestant throughout his life. Anti-Catholicism in the United States was very mainstream in the 1940s when Clare Luce converted. So she received a torrent of mail, some of it from other Catholics, many of them also Catholic converts, celebrating the news and welcoming her in. A lot of it incredibly hostile, anti-Catholic vitriol from other people saying, oh, well, good for you. Now you're part of the fascist papacy. And how could we possibly trust anything you say anymore? You're just going to be doing whatever the Pope tells you to do, which was a common anti-Catholic narrative in American culture.
Right. And it continues well up into the election of 1960 and well, even to today, really. How does it affect her subsequent career? What does she do after the conversion, and how, are there any ways in which Catholicism enhances it or doesn't enhance it?
Well, her career takes a real shift after this. One of the things she does is she announces that she's not going to run for re-election. Her conversion happens in February 1946, so there would have been an election campaign happening for that year, for that November's election. She doesn't run. And she instead spends a few years on the lecture circuit, talking to mostly Catholic audiences, but also women's groups and civic groups, about why she thinks Catholicism is the antidote to communism and why Catholic belief, the real presence, and Catholic identity will defend American minds against the infection of communist ideas. And she is also during this time trying to write her spiritual memoir, her spiritual autobiography. And she can't do it. And she blames Henry. She says, she writes to him that the narrative of the convert is supposed to have this glorious, happy ending when you're renewed and you're happy in your faith. But because of your portrayal, my story has a terrible ending. I can't write it.
Yeah.
And she was managing her image always. She instead does a big article for McCall's magazine in the spring of 1947. It's printed in 3 spring issues in McCall's. And that's instead how she tells her story. But she does spend a few years trying to figure out what to do now that she's not in public office. And it's subsequent to that she's appointed the ambassador to Italy and the Vatican, and then continues to sort of find her way, whether in she considers a run for the Senate, but loses in the primary. She is nominated later on to be the ambassador to Brazil, but has to withdraw because she says something snarky and it gets picked up in the press. And she sort of says, okay, fine, I'll not do any more of this. She's by that point in her 60s and sort of finds a retirement, living mostly in Hawaii, scuba diving. She drops acid, writes about it, has a whole variety of other experiences. But the conversion ends her time in Congress, and she never again holds any elected office.
But is she sort of taken in by I don't want to say by what was called at the time the Catholic mob, the Kennedys, the Smiths, that sort of, they're part of American politics that was Catholic and was always pushing against the bigotry. Does she become part of that club and part of that circle as well, or was she already in it? Sort of those people worked in all kinds of different worlds.
Socially, she was already in that world.
Okay.
She talks about meeting various Kennedys when she was a young woman and her mother's trying to marry her off into a powerful family. Certainly through Henry Luce, they would all have been a part of the social life of wealthy, politically connected people between New York City, where Time Magazine is published, where that empire is, and Washington, D.C.'s center for political power. So she already knew a lot of those people. She was a Republican. She'd been a Democrat in the 30s. She was fully Republican by, I believe, the 1940 election. And but she does support Kennedy, but he's the only Democrat for president that she supports after that point. Of course, I don't know who she voted for. But she was friendly with Kennedy, and she made sure that Time Magazine said some nice things about him as well.
Well, this is a good place for us to take a break. We need to do a little sponsorship mongering. So let's do that, and we'll come back and talk about another very, very famous conversion with Dr. Rebecca Davis. Back in a moment. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, with Dr. Rebecca Davis talking about one of the most interesting books that's come along in a long time, Public Confessions, the Religious Conversions That Changed American Politics. And before we left, we talked about Clare Boothe Luce and her conversion to Catholicism. And now I'd like to ask you, well, before we go on to the person I want to talk about next, we need to say that you've examined a number of people here: Whittaker Chambers, Sammy Davis Jr., Marilyn Monroe, who I should have you back on and we'll just talk about that one episode because it's so fascinating, and Chuck Colson. So there are a lot of people in this book, and the very publicness of their nature and their careers makes all this so interesting. But now I'd like to ask you about your chapter on Muhammad Ali, because it's absolutely fascinating. I remember vaguely this when I was very, very young, this happened. And I've always been fascinated by looking at YouTube clips about how disrespectfully he was treated by the media and other people when this conversion happened. So let's tell the Buzzkillers who he was before, first of all, and then we'll move on to the conversion and what happened in that case. So who was Muhammad Ali before he was Muhammad Ali?
Muhammad Ali was a kid from Louisville, Kentucky, who was a boxer, and he won the gold in boxing at the 1960 Olympics in Rome. So he had become extremely famous. He was young. He was just 18 years old when he won the heavyweight boxing gold at the Rome Olympics. And he had a flair that people picked up on. He drove Cadillacs, and he had this very splashy sensibility, fashion sensibility. And he was starting to win a lot of big bouts on the heavyweight boxing circuit in the United States. And one of the most famous of which was a February 1964 fight against Sonny Liston in Miami, Florida. Muhammad Ali was then called Cassius Clay, Cassius Clay Jr.
That was the name he was born with. That's his family name, yeah.
He was incredibly famous as Cassius Clay. Sports writers were sort of fascinated by him, but also a little bit derisive in their reporting on him because he didn't behave like your typical boxer. So take the fight in Miami against Sonny Liston. Liston was a classic heavyweight boxer. He just packed a mean punch, and people worried. The talk among the sports reporters covering the match was whether or not they thought Cassius Clay Jr. would survive a rounds in the ring with Sonny Liston. He was so powerful a hitter. But what Cassius Clay did, that reporters at the time kind of couldn't decide what to make of, was he danced around. He was very light on his feet. He was very nimble. When you go back and look at it, you see just this extraordinary athlete. Not only was he physically impressive, though a heavyweight, he was, at this time, slim in his muscularity. He just had this gorgeous muscular figure in the ring. But he didn't just go in for the heaviest punch. He avoided Liston's punches. He ducked and dodged and managed to keep Liston punching long enough that he got exhausted. Then he started to hit back. And a lot of the sports commentators were really pretty insulting about Cassius Clay, saying, this isn't a real boxer. Real boxers punch. They don't just duck the other guy's punches. Right around this time, though, Cassius Clay had been approached by preachers from the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a pretty new religious group at the time. It started in the 1930s in the urban north among African Americans and people of mixed race backgrounds who rejected Christianity and who instead created a synthetic religion that took aspects of Islam, that took aspects of other religious ideas, and created a movement that had a whole different narrative of the Earth's origins, of the origins of racial differences, and that created a mythology that emphasized the superiority and the importance of Africa and of Black people, and of their need to be separate theologically, politically, economically from white people. And preachers did a lot of outreach. Missionaries from the church did a lot of outreach, including to Cassius Clay and his brother Rudy. And both brothers were really taken with the message of the Nation of Islam about the beauty of Blackness, the pride in Black history and African history of their ancestry, and of this really unique cosmology in which their people played a significant role. So he announces, Cassius Clay then announces right after winning the match against Sonny Liston, not only surviving, but winning in this upset victory, announces the next day that he, as has been rumored, that he is in fact a member of the Nation of Islam, and he's super proud of it. Mm-hmm. He then becomes even more notorious for his affiliation with the Nation of Islam. Not only is he a really unconventional boxer, he has publicly aligned with an extremely controversial faith. The general public narrative about the Nation of Islam was shaped at the time by these big journalistic investigations that described this as the big 1959 story was the hate that hate produced, right? That decades, centuries of racism in the United States had laid the foundations for the emergence of a comparably hateful religious movement that just directed that hatred in the opposite direction, mm-hmm. which was a really problematic and simplistic way to understand the whole cosmos of African origins, of spiritual connection that was part of what the Nation of Islam taught. But at any rate, right around that time, the leader of the Nation of Islam, a guy named Elijah Muhammad, gives Cassius Clay a new name, gives him the name Muhammad Ali. And that then becomes another point of controversy because sportscasters or sports announcers keep introducing him as Cassius Clay.
Yeah.
And in newspaper reports, they'll say, they'll put in quotations, Muhammad Ali, and then in parentheses, AKA Cassius Clay, this sort of mockery of this idea that he has a new name, that the name is in fact legitimate, and Clay gets booed for demanding that he be announced as Muhammad Ali, the name that he has been given and accepted from his spiritual leader in the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, here, among other things, we're showing that history and memory can be a problematic thing. I just said in introducing this subject that I remember this happening, and actually the conversion, you're right, the conversion was after the Liston fight, and I was yet to be born for 2 or 3 more years. So, but I remember people talking about it even into the late 60s. So it was a really big deal, and it was almost as if, on the one hand, he betrayed traditional boxing by being so stylistically different, and then betrayed traditional America by converting to Islam from presumably an African-American Protestant background.
Yes, he'd been raised in an African-American, I think, Baptist family, and he rejected that. What's consistent about him is his pride mm-hmm. and his really powerful sense of self-worth. He described as a teenager listening to records from the Nation of Islam. At the time, we forget how these messages circulated in the past, but it was very common for preachers to record their sermons on records, which you could then go and purchase. And so there was a record by the guy who later became Louis Farrakhan, who was a former calypso singer, and he recorded an album of a sort of song speech. And young Cassius Clay, living in his parents' home in Louisville, listened to it on repeat, just listened over and over again to this record. And the title of it was The White Man's Heaven is the Black Man's Hell. And it spoke to him. It explained a lot to him about the circumstances of his parents' struggles to strive for a middle-class life for themselves and their children, to the racism he encountered out in the world. And he already had these ideas in his mind, but he also took from it a message of pride. And he carried that with him, and he was publicly proud. He wasn't quietly proud. He was boastful. He was grandiose. He was funny. And he loved the limelight. And so he didn't see his new faith as anything to hide. Quite the contrary. Once he made the decision to say, yes, the rumors are true, I'm a member of the Nation of Islam, he would talk about it to anyone who would listen. He had been quiet about it up to that point, but after that 1964 announcement, he was never quiet about it again.
Now, presumably at this time, and I don't know because this is not my field, most Americans wouldn't really know about Islam and its tenets. People in urban areas might know about Islam and the Nation of Islam because that had been growing in urban areas. But for the most part, people wouldn't know unless you'd been studied it somewhat at college as one of the world's largest religions. It would just seem odd to you or just would be literally unknown to a great number of Americans.
Absolutely. What was known about Islam was often stereotypes or misconceptions, these long-held sort of sexualized parodies of the Turkish harem or gender nonconforming / salacious doings of people in the Middle East. The sexual stereotypes and the racial stereotypes were very much connected in the way that a lot of people thought Islam worked. So when Ali went to pray, praying 5 times a day, facing Mecca, he was following this ancient set of teachings that he was learning through the Nation of Islam by going to their temples and attending classes on Islam that he was taking, learning through these mentors that he had in the nation. None of that was understood by the vast majority of Americans. And the newspaper magazine coverage about his conversion certainly didn't enlighten most people in any helpful way about what Islam was about.
So in a way, you already have someone who's unpopular because he's flashy and his boxing style is different. So he's in many ways unpopular with the media and the sort of sporting establishment, so to speak. Now he's unpopular with, or at least he is bewildering to people who just don't understand Islam. That's sort of the majority, if you will, the majority opinion. What sort of support did he get from people in the African-American community? Presumably he's very supported by the Nation of Islam, but we only hear the negative. I mean, I'm sure you can find on YouTube lots of clips of reporters saying, "Hey, Cassius, you getting ready for the fight?" And him saying, "No, my name's Muhammad Ali. Call me by my name," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What sort of support did he have from other people rather than most of America, so to speak?
A lot of his support came from within the Nation of Islam. And when we think about why people convert and how they identify with a religious faith, when it's done in this very individualistic way that Muhammad Ali's conversion happened, he wasn't getting married and converting as part of creating a new family or something like that. The support network of the faith that the person enters is sustaining. And he fully immersed himself in the life of the Nation of Islam. He attended rallies. He was a regular at the temples in the various cities where he would visit. One of his early mentors was Malcolm X. They described one another as brothers, that they were very close, had a mutual respect for one another. They had a falling out in the 6 months or so before Malcolm X's assassination. Malcolm X had nevertheless been an early source of support for Ali in his journey into the Nation of Islam. He does not have support from his parents, for the most part. His father does not come across well in the historical record. His father was most likely pretty abusive, certainly was glad to say nasty things about his son to reporters, say that his son was of low intelligence and things like that. So that's not a good sign. His brother Rudy also converted to the Nation of Islam, also joined the Nation of Islam. And so he was, it appears, a source of great support. They seem to have been very, very close. Ali got married a couple times. His second marriage was to a woman who was already a member of the Nation of Islam. He found family through that, but he did not get support from his parents in his conversion.
That must have been very difficult, but it sounds like he had a troubled relationship with them anyway.
There's a tendency when we have people make these sort of dramatic changes in their lives to try to see what was it about their childhoods or their early lives that maybe pushed them to reject what their parents had taught them and offered them and to choose something different. And I understand that temptation, and I'm sure that I've succumbed to it as well in my own historical research. And I think it's equally important to think about what were the qualities of the faith or the belief system the person chose that drew them toward that faith. There are any number of other ideologies or belief systems that Ali might have chosen to devote himself to in seeking a different life than the one he'd been given by his parents. Mm-hmm. The emphasis on particularly proud Black manhood, because women in the nation had a subordinate position. So the emphasis from the Nation of Islam on proud Black manhood and this idea that you weren't a person plagued by oppression, but in fact, the inheritor of this race of people who had at the beginnings of the world been the leaders. I think that really spoke to him and drew him in.
And do we see an increase in conversions partly because, if we can't prove that it's because of his conversion, his very public conversion, then at least there might be a correlation in conversions to Islam in the 60s? Is there anything like that going on in the African American community?
Malcolm X was the greatest evangelizer for the Nation of Islam. Okay. He brought tons of people in. I don't know that Muhammad Ali didn't really do missionary work that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Professor, we don't want to talk about all the people in the book because, of course, we want people to get the book, and the book is extremely readable and extremely important. But it's not just a series of case studies. This is one of the things that's so interesting about it. You are drawing larger conclusions about the nature of American religion and about the sort of public reaction to religious change in this book. So what are the sort of larger themes in the book that you found as you did the research into these case studies?
A couple of the themes that emerge from the book are, on the one hand, how tricky the American investment in religion as the basis for democracy was, mm-hmm. and how complicated it became to say democracy in the United States is what separates us from the communists, and the thing that buttresses democracy is faith. These are the years where we add "In God We Trust" and "Under God" to our currency and the Pledge of Allegiance, when U.S. presidents start talking about God and all of their important public speeches. There is this, in domestic and foreign policy, after World War II, for about 3 or 4 decades, there is this concerted effort to put religion front and center in American political life as the thing that distinguishes us from communists and that preserves democracy. Mm-hmm. But what I kept finding when I was looking at these stories was that certain religions didn't count, or certain religions really complicated that notion that religion was the thing holding up democracy. And so certainly Catholicism in the late 1940s, when Clare Boothe Luce converted, was given this sort of token inclusion under the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian umbrella. But in actuality, anti-Catholicism still dominated American politics, was still very prevalent in American politics. In addition, conversions to Judaism, to the Nation of Islam, did not have the same winning power that religious identity based in Protestantism had. So that was one of the things that emerged for me. The other one, though, was about how certain converts could, through their conversions, come to exemplify authentic American politics. And we have this thing now in American politics where certain people's faith becomes a way of validating them as truth tellers, as quote unquote real Americans, as people possessing sets of ideas that we should trust. And I see the responses to these conversions and the work that these conversions did in American public life as laying the foundation for this new consolidation, this new integration of religion into authentic American political identity. I hope your listeners will take a look at the book and read about Chuck Colson and some of these other born again evangelical Protestant converts in the 1970s and the work that that did to really present a particular image of American democracy as the version that was true and authentic, and that those religious voices were the authentic voices.
Yes, and of course we see this happening. We've been seeing this happening, the election of Barack Obama and the controversy over whether he was a Muslim or not, and on and on and on. It's a gripping book, Buzzkillers. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. As always, please go get it, and you'll be enlightened, let me say that. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Dr. Davis, so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on. It's you have a wonderful show, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Well, we have a wonderful show, but it's because of the experts we interview. And please come back and talk to us about Marilyn Monroe. I want my ratings to go up through the roof, and I think that will do it. So, Buzzkillers, please go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com. Do everything you do there. Subscribe to our newsletter where you can get the episodes. Support us on Patreon. And perhaps most importantly, go to your podcast platform and rate and review us. That makes a huge difference in how we are seen across the country and across the world. And we'll talk to all of you out there next week.